Hey, and welcome back to the Beyond the Scale podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Spencer Nadolsky, and I have with me today a special guest, Dr. Gary Fosser, Chief Scientific Officer of Weight Watchers, and also a shill. If I'm a shill for big pharma, he's a shill for big mindset, and I love it because we have talked about nutrition and fitness, and obviously the drugs a lot on this podcast. But one of the things lacking that I really wanted to get Dr. Gary on here for is talking about mindset stuff. So thanks. Welcome, Gary.
It's great to be with you, Spencer. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So, we've chatted a little bit about your background, and you've done a lot of studies in terms of just behavioral therapy and intensive behavioral therapy and looking at randomized trials. We had your co-worker on, Dr. Michelle, to talk about kind of how much weight loss can you expect from nutrition and whatever. But I kind of wanted to go over the exact mindset, behavioral change type of stuff that your expertise is in. Mm-hmm. And you wrote a book.
Yeah. I wrote a book a couple of years ago. It's about to come out in paperback. It's called The Shift. And it's really based on this premise that it took me a long time to come to this, embarrassingly so. But after being in the field and doing clinical trials and working one-on-one with patients and working groups of 10, groups of 100, and now with thousands and millions at Weight Watchers, one of the things that I learned in talking to folks and doing quantitative surveys, and as a scientist, you're always looking for what's the thing, right? What's the deciding, precipitating factor of who keeps weight off and who doesn't. And I thought it would be people who exercised or, people consistently, and there's some data to support that, people who track regularly. It turned out that all those things matter, right? But they're not unimportant. But the thing that mattered most, the thing that most distinguished people who kept their weight off and those who didn't, was the way they thought. And specifically the way they thought about themselves and the way they thought about the journey. So then I started to look at the science around those topics, everything from cognitive behavioral therapy to positive psychology, and looking at ways that we could, which we often do at Weight Watchers, take science and scale it through giving people science-based techniques. So not just, it's nice to, be grateful. What are the techniques, the proven techniques that would give you a sense of gratitude and happiness? So that's really where the genesis of the book came from. And although it's consistent with who I am as a psychologist and thinking about the psychology of the process, it's different than I would have expected. Is it, fat cell size and number? Is it metabolic rate? Is it those kind of things? So it's been an interesting journey.
Yeah. Okay. So let's kind of dive into that. What's the number one thing? If you had to pick one thing, what is it that's about the mindset?
Yeah, by far it's practicing self-compassion.
Okay.
And it's important for empirical reasons. In terms of the science is very clear that, and this is counterintuitive, by the way, people think that the harsher you are on yourself, the more derogatory things you say to yourself, that somehow that lifts your motivational state. And the science is clear that it does for a millisecond or two. But then I often say this to patients with whom I'm working is, that's you're talking about. Mm-hmm. You really calling yourself an idiot? Are you really calling yourself weak-willed, undisciplined, lazy? People say the most nasty things to themselves internally that they would never utter to any other human being. And that's fact one. Fact two is that for people who are living with overweight and obesity, the societal stigma and discrimination exacerbates this sense of being denigrating to yourself. So you have a double whammy that there's just a human nature thing, I got to be tough and tough love works, and the nastier I am, the more motivated I'll be. That's myth. There's no science around that. Science is the opposite. And then you have by your physical demographics of height, weight, and you're deemed by society to be somehow less than, it fuels this fire. So, how does this all work out is really important to me, not just to say, be nice to yourself.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
How do you do that? And again, there's science-based techniques around this. the easiest one, and I think the one that I found to be the most useful clinically, is to talk to yourself like a friend, and to think for a moment about what a friend would be. Right? This isn't a friend who says, "Oh, everything's great." Like, "Oh, you gained 3 pounds this week. I hope it happens next week." Like, friends can be realistic, but also objective and kind. And to me, it's almost about the tone of voice and the way the body language that you might talk to a friend with. So when you are in a situation, let's say that you haven't eaten or moved in a way that you had planned, or you had and the scale doesn't agree, like that's just the way scales go. They're imperfect measures, and I'm sure you've talked about that a lot here on this podcast. What would you say to yourself? So do an inventory. So I'd say, I've blown it. Here I go again. I'll never be able to do this. And contrast that to what you would say to a friend if they brought you the same set of facts. You might say, well, it sounds like you're doing great this week. Scale's a bad measure. Like, keep at it. Or, life gets in the way sometimes. Don't expect yourself to be perfect. Get right back on track. And that difference, the way you talk to yourself, leaves you feeling quite different. It feels you quite literally feeling taken care of. And this isn't just like psycho mumbo jumbo, let's think good thoughts and be happy and lose weight. There's empirical evidence, and Kristen Neff has done a lot of the great work on this, and she's got a great workbook on self-compassion that I highly recommend. This actually makes a substantial difference in how people feel and what they do.
So there have been like trials, and because some might say this is kind of an innate thing. It was since you were born, your parents might have treated you a certain way, and certain genetics, blah 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 blah. And you can't teach an old dog new tricks. You're saying that it is possible to help people shift into this, and it does have a positive outcome.
Absolutely, yeah, and that's what the techniques are about. And again, that's what I'm really committed to, as somebody who's been in the field for a while now, but also in my role at Weight Watchers. We just can't say to people, do this, do that.
Right.
We have to give them techniques that are practical, actionable, and importantly, science-based.
So one of them is talking to yourself like a friend. I think that's pretty actionable.
Yeah.
Well, okay, then if that's number one, what's the next one?
I think there's the other one is to be able to look at the kind of thoughts you have. And this is more specific. So self-compassion is really how you're viewing yourself, right, along the journey. This second way of thinking, or this second shift, if you will, is how you think about the journey for those times that you have setbacks. And many people have an overly negative filtering style. And this is based on the work by a famous psychiatrist named Aaron Beck, who pioneered cognitive behavioral therapy back in the mid-'60s at the University of Pennsylvania. And he pioneered it for the treatment of depression, subsequently anxiety, and a lot of other conditions. But in my experience, it's really relevant to weight management. And there are 15 different styles that Dr. Beck described, but I'm just going to focus on a couple. One is that there is this sense of a negative filter. So think about it outside of weight management context. You get feedback from your boss on your annual review, and they say, these 3 things are great. This thing needs improvement. Depending on your cognitive style, you're going to focus on that one thing. You're not going to hear about the 3 things. And similarly, when people do, they've had a great week. This used to strike me when people would come in and I'd say, how was your week? Oh, it was terrible. Well, tell me about your week. How'd you do with your calories or your points? Or, oh, it was great. 6 out of the 7 days I was perfect. But then Saturday night, boy, all they can think about is Saturday night. They don't think about 6 out of 7. They think about the one day they didn't hit their activity goal rather than the 5 days they did. So that kind of filtering, again, is just, it's not accurate. So this isn't like think happy thoughts. Let's think realistic thoughts. This isn't the power of positive thinking. This is the power of realistic thinking. And a technique to do that, there's 2 ways to do that. One is to do a reality check and just to ask yourself, like, what's the basis of this, right? You could You could do that almost in an adversarial lawyer type fashion. Like, what are the facts that support that this was a terrible week? Maybe there's a fact to support that Saturday night was a little rough for you, but
Yeah.
does that mean it's so to have that sort of confrontational, give me the facts? The other is, this is another variant on talk to yourself like a friend, is what would a friend, if you presented these data to a friend, what would they say objectively? They'd say 6 out of 7 days were, you knocked it out of the park. One day was a rough day.
How do you internalize that? So, okay, I'm just going to give you an example.
Mm-hmm.
For me personally, and this, doctors say this all the time, when we're in the clinic, we'll have 10 to 20 people in a normal day. 19 of those patient encounters can go perfectly, and the people are so appreciative, and there can be one bad apple that ruined the day. And because in my mind, I'm like, I know this is one person. I just had 19 other people that were great, and they were so appreciative, but this one person was so mean, and just and I like know it objectively, and I can say those things. How do you I'm just asking almost personally, but like, because I know it's like I know objectively, and I know that these patients know objectively, because I tell them all this. I use like the all or nothing type of thing mentality. It's like, well, no, in grade school we didn't get zeros or 100%. We usually got in between, some percentage. A B is okay, 80 some percent. So like, you might have had one bad meal or one bad day, and you still passed for this week, and people know that objectively, but it's still that it's really hard to not think about that negative interaction or situation. How do you get people around that?
Yeah, one is just to normalize it, that it's a human nature thing, right? That we tend to sense change or threat or something that's different. Like, that's where our vigilance comes in from an evolutionary point of view. But then it's like any other thing. We talk about eating habits and activity habits all the time. There are thinking habits, and you change thinking habits the same way you do eating and activity. That is, you raise your consciousness about them. So you could track them, you could note them, you could think about them, and then to use a technique to undo it. So in that case where you have, 20 great encounters and one that's not so great, I think it's worth just stepping back and saying, okay, let's be objective. Is there anything I could have done differently in this situation? Like, let's not just like whitewash it and say, oh, that person's this. Okay, maybe I contributed to this, maybe I didn't. And if I did, okay, I know what to do better next time. If I didn't, to say, okay, this is out of my control. There was probably a lot going on for that person that day, and I've got to own what I can own and continue to be the best. And I think just having that internal dialogue, sometimes people like to write it down, like, what are the facts here? And, are my conclusions supported? That's helpful. But I don't think it has to be written down. I think just going through that mental rehearsal can be really, really effective for folks.
I like it. Do you talk about kind of that acceptance-based therapy time? Basically what you're saying is like, control what you can and just accept what you can't. That's kind of what you're referring to.
Yeah, I think that's part of it, in terms of if you look at a situation that didn't go your way, right? Let's say, going back to eating for a second, that Saturday night went off the rails because you went to a wedding. What could you have done differently? Maybe, again, in an objective, filled with self-compassion point of view, not a denigrating, I screwed this up again, I can't believe I did it. That doesn't help. That puts you in a position of weakness. What self-compassion does is put you in a position of strength. I'm worth taking care of as I am right this millisecond, no matter what I weigh, no matter what I eat, I'm worth taking care of. So in that spirit, let me look at how I might do things differently on Saturday night. Maybe I mistakenly fasted all day because I knew I was going to go to a wedding, and I was starving, and I ate a lot of hors d'oeuvres and had 2 glasses of wine instead of 1. Or maybe the dessert wasn't that great, but I just did it out of habit, or whatever. And again, this is not a sense of being critical. It's just looking at the facts and then moving from there.
I like it. Okay, if there's one last tidbit, we don't have to go into all 7 of your shifts from your book, but what would be your last best little piece?
I think especially when it comes to weight management, people have this mistaken notion, and it's sort of a parallel or an ancillary of self-compassion, and that's how people think about their body. And the mistaken notion, the mythology is that the more I dislike my body, the more motivated I'll be and the more I have to lose weight. And there's something, again, weirdly intuitively appealing about this, right? Or seemingly logical, right? Because if I'm a certain weight and I don't like my body, and then I say that should fuel the journey. The absolute opposite is true. And I've actually done two of these studies. Colleagues have done, 10 or 20 of them, where you actually measure people's satisfaction with their body. So their body image before a weight management program. And it turns out that the people who like their bodies the most before a weight management program actually do better, not worse.
That's counterintuitive.
Yeah, it is counterintuitive. And it goes again to, if you're always denigrating yourself, it's hard to like yourself if you hate your body.
Mm-hmm.
And it's such a fundamental part of who we are. And again, this is based on a lot of science that was done by Tom Cash at Old Dominion, and has a great workbook on all aspects of body. It doesn't necessarily have to do with weight. You don't like your ears or whatever. It's a great book that I would highly recommend. And one of the things that can be really useful in terms of appreciating your body, and again, this is easy to say, right? Like your body. Well, society's bombarding you frequently, if you're living with overweight and obesity, that your body somehow doesn't measure up. So a way to counteract that is to think through, okay, what does my body do for me? Let's abandon this idea of how do I compare to some aesthetic ideal, and think more about what does my body do for me? Particularly for women who might be worried about, their body or their belly particularly. Like, this body birthed human beings.
Mm-hmm.
I'm worried about my arms being flabby. Those arms allow me to hug my kids or my spouse or my partner. They allow me to pick up groceries. Like, to think about all the fantastic things your body does. My legs let me ambulate up steps. Like, we take all that stuff for granted while we're like saying, this is too big, this is too flabby. And again, the science is very clear on this. The more you like your body, the better you'll do in a weight management program.
Interesting.
And it's again, counterintuitive, but
I think that would be interesting for just, sequence members, if we got some sort of cohort together, and just from a medical management, because in the context you're discussing is lifestyle only. Is that right? Or have there been medical management studies?
Most of those trials have been done in behavioral treatment. I'd have to think back if there's any of the studies that we did that I've done a lot of studies that combine behavioral and pharmacologic treatment. So I have to go back and look at the data set, but it would be interesting to do in people who are going to lose significantly more weight with pharmacologic agents than you might with typical behavioral programs. Now
the question is, can you do an RCT to see if you get people to like their body better, then do better? Have they done that?
There's early work by James Rosen at the University of Vermont that manipulated that, and the results were a little mixed. So then you wonder questions: was the intervention potent enough to change body image?
That's an
you have the confound of that when you lose weight, your body image gets better. So maybe there's basically a depending on how you're looking at a floor or ceiling effect, that weight loss improves body image. But frankly, that's happened in other studies that we and others have done, even in the context of your body image getting better. People who start off higher do better in terms of weight loss.
That would be really cool to see. So, okay. So now, you're working with me. We're trying to look at research and trying to combine this idea of powerful behavioral therapy with pharmacotherapy and really maximize or make the best of all worlds. How do you see like the mindset shifts? Is the drugs seem to take away that biological drive, but there are patients that I have these podcasts on, like what we call hypo responders. There's people that aren't responding as well as what you would see on average just due to the pharmacology and the biology. So I'm wondering, do you see a world where we intervene early when we don't see that rate of weight loss in these hypo responders maybe, and seeing if there should be some biological component, but maybe it's not enough for them to overcome it, to where some of these mindset shifts maybe have a powerful impact in those individuals. I don't know. I don't know if you've thought about that kind of thing, but
Yeah, I have, and I think the power of the biological treatments, as you well know, reduces the noise, right? And I don't think there's a better way to say it.
Food noise. We call it food
Yeah,
noise.
right, exactly. I think that's different than a mindset shift. I think a mindset shift is more how you view yourself and have the journey. So even in the context of potent pharmacologic agents, there will be setbacks. And they could be rational setbacks, that you gain weight and you were off track for some reason, that you overrode the biology, although that doesn't seem to happen as much with this new generation of meds. It could also be that there's some mythological thinking about the medication. So I could imagine people who have a very self-critical view of themselves rather than a self-compassionate, even when they're successful in pharmacotherapy, could be saying things like, oh, this is the easy way out, and I shouldn't tell anybody I used meds, and it's only because I don't have enough willpower. Like, that's going to disrupt the journey, even in the presence of a biological agent.
We do see that. We do see that.
Yeah. I've actually been thinking about how to, forget the book for a second, but in my mind, it's like a chapter of the book that, had I written this book now, I would include. And that is, what are the mindset shifts that are necessary and that are unique for a pharmacologic journey? Let's say, for example, I don't know, there's a change in insurance and people have to discontinue meds. What kind of things would they say to themselves? Or if they're on a medication holiday, or whatever the case may be, there will be ups and downs in any journey, whether it's biologically driven or not. So I think there's still room for mindset to play a big role.
Cool. I love it. I'm excited for what we come up together with. Anything else you want to add? We don't really need to keep going on and on. I just wanted to get a quick little intro to mindset. And I think what you discuss goes way beyond, hey, maybe we should try to eat better dietary quality. It's like, everybody knows that. These are completely different than what we usually talk about. So I appreciate you coming on and discussing.
Well, thanks, Spencer. It's my pleasure. I think what I would leave you and your listeners with is that this idea of how central self-compassion is to the journey. It allows you to build from a position of strength rather than weakness. And a scientific fact I'll leave you with is that self-compassion beats self-criticism every single time.
Yeah. I think that's good life advice, by the way, not just for weight management.
I think it generalizes beyond weight. It generalizes to work performance, relationships. I agree.
Thank you so much for coming on, Gary. We'll have to have you on again.
My pleasure.